my worst fears came to fruition, and he told me that the plane had gone down on the beach at King's Beach, and my husband and my granddaughter, Lucinda, that I was raising, were both killed on impact. And so again, my world just started to spiral.
Hi Roma, how are you today?
Hi Lee, I'm going well, thanks.
Hey, that's good, thanks. Thanks for sharing your journey and all that, and your beautiful home here. So, how did you come to know about Jesus or start following him?
Well, basically, I grew up in a small country town in New South Wales called Coonabarabran. And I grew up with all my extended family and friends, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and it was just a lovely little town to grow up in. But we didn't have a lot of shops, and I loved to read. Anyway, one day I went into the newsagents, and on the shelf they had a few magazines and some books. So I picked up a book, and I read that book, and I loved that book. And somehow I lost it. And for years I was looking for that book. And way down the track I became a Christian, and someone mentioned the name of the book. And I went, that's the book. And I didn't know it was a Christian book. It was called The Cross and the Switchblade.
Ah, yeah, I know that book.
By David Wilkinson.
Mm.
And when I read that book, it just planted a seed in my heart that I just wanted to be a missionary when I grew up. I had no idea
Awesome.
what that entailed, but that little book just spoke to me and I loved it.
Wow. How old did you say you were at that
I was
age?
about 14 at the
yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and it just impacted my life. And then way down the track, when I was an adult and I was going through some really difficult times with my teenage daughter, she was on drugs, and I was teaching. I was a teacher of fashion. And one of my students, at the end of the class, she said, oh, how's everything? And I just shared with her basically about my daughter, Danielle. And she said, oh, there's two things I really love. She said, I love going to church and I love my husband. And I just said, oh, what church do you go to? And she told me, and she said, oh, do you want to come along? And I said, oh, okay. Well, the first week I didn't go. But the following week, after the next class, she said, do you want to come this week? And I did, and I just went along, and yeah, the message just spoke to my heart, and I became a Christian.
Wow. Do you remember, what happened with the message, or what did you sense God there or something?
I remember the message, and I'd never heard that word before. It was about intercession, which is about praying for other people. But I do recall that after the service, and they just spoke to me and just told me that I'd become a Christian and explained it to me, that I just could not stop crying because I just felt the love of God in that room.
Wow.
And I remember when we went for a drive that afternoon, I went for a drive with my husband, and God had just done something supernatural. My eyes were open. I remember looking at this dam with all these lilies on it, and oh my gosh, they were just so beautiful. It was amazing. I looked at a flower, and like the stamens, they were just, everything was just different from that point on.
So even just the flowers and that, you just saw differently in a different light.
He just opened my eyes.
Wow.
Opened my eyes to his beauty.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it was
Curious
amazing.
question, you said you just experienced the love of God, like what was that like? Can you put it into words, or?
Yeah, I didn't know what was going on really at that point in time, but I couldn't stop crying because it was like a release of the frustrations and things that were happening with my daughter, and I didn't know how to solve them, but there was just something there, which I now know is Jesus, that, was just fill the room.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Very cool. So where did you, now you'd met Jesus, yeah, why did you choose to continue to follow him?
I knew that from that point on that God was real.
Mm.
And my life had took a huge turn down the track, quite a few turns actually, and it was just my relationship with him that really helped me work through each of those different traumas that I'd had in life.
Mm.
And the first one basically started when I was,
And the phone goes.
oh,
Yes, you're saying about the first one?
yeah, in my life, everything seemed to be going really well as I was growing up, but when I turned 16, my mum, who all of my security was in my mum, she was just gorgeous,
Mm.
and she got ovarian cancer,
Wow.
and she passed away at the age of 35.
Oh.
And my dad, who'd come from the city, rang me because I was away on holidays after Mum died with a girlfriend, and he just rang me and said that he was going back to the city, and he took all that he wanted and said, you and your brother just pack up the house. He said, and you're going to live with your auntie and uncle and 3 children. So Dad deserted me at the time where I really needed him, and my life just took a 360-degree turn. So I took my little dog called Happy, my sausage dog, and I went and lived with my auntie and uncle. I was with them for a couple of years until I married, and then I finished school with them, staying with them, and then I married, and I had 2 children of my own, Danielle and Jamie. We moved to Sydney, and we met some people who knew my son when he was playing soccer, and we moved overseas to the Cook Islands and went in partnership.
Wow.
And built a marine zoo of all things. And while we were over there, the other couple were bigger sharks than the ones in the ocean.
Oh, no.
And they ripped us off for everything that we own, and we came back to Australia with basically nothing and a debt.
Wow.
And our marriage was in disarray. But we worked through that. We really did. And we stayed in Sydney. We both got jobs. But Sydney is quite a hard place to bring up children, and my daughter was introduced to drugs there. So we moved to the Sunshine Coast to try and get her into a better environment to bring her and Jamie up. But drugs were just something that were everywhere, and they were prolific. So she mixed with the wrong company, and at one stage she just disappeared for months on end. We didn't know where she was. I was beside myself, really. And I didn't know what to do, and it was during that time, like I said, when I was teaching, that I met this lady who told me about church, and I went along, and that's when I met Jesus. And so I became what they classify as born again. Okay,
Yeah.
at the same age, actually, 35, I dreaded the age of coming up to the same age that my mum died.
Yeah. Understandable.
But instead of dying, I was born again.
Wow.
Which was
you did
pretty.
die and get born again.
Yeah,
Wow.
pretty incredible.
That is
actually.
really cool.
Yeah, it is.
I love that.
It is.
Timing of God. I hear that so often, things like that, and
Yeah,
that's so cool.
yeah. And then fast forward down the track, my daughter, she actually worked through the process of drugs. She went down to the country and worked on a farm as a farmhand, as a jillaroo, and became, she worked there in the hot western sun, fixing fences and crutching fly-blown sheep as you do in Australia. And without any help, cold turkey, she came off the drugs.
Wow.
And my daughter came back to the Sunshine Coast drug-free. And I was so proud of her,
Good
so
on her.
immensely proud of her. And then she became a Christian too, which was
Awesome.
just wonderful. And she was laying down on the beach actually, and she just said, Jesus, if you're real, come into my heart. And he did.
Wow.
And it just transformed her life. However, she met a young man and moved in with him, and unfortunately he was still on drugs, but she had two babies to him, but it didn't work out. And so she decided to get away, go to the country and visit family and friends. And while she was down there, a car broke down, and through a whole series of events, she ended up at a women's refuge that she should not have been allowed in. But the lady there said, look, it's going to be demolished in a week. She said, I'll bend the rules for you. You need a place to stay. So she let Danielle and 2 children in. And there was only one other occupant in that place. And Danielle didn't feel comfortable around her. She was a little bit strange. And on the Sunday morning, she'd had everything packed. She was ready to come home to the Sunshine Coast. And that woman broke into her room at 1 a.m. with a kitchen knife, and she brutally murdered my daughter,
What?
stabbing her 30 times. And she kidnapped my 2 grandchildren. She took my daughter's car, her purse with all of her identification, and she took off with my grandchildren, and they were with her, and she had 2 young boys of her own for 17 hours. And the trauma that they must have experienced, having witnessed what had happened and being with another lady in their car without their mummy, I can't imagine.
Man, that's horrific.
Yeah, they apprehended the woman when she tried to attack a pregnant lady at a fete, and somehow they apprehended her and took her to the police station. By the time they contacted us, it was late that night, about 8 p.m. So we quickly hired a small plane and a pilot and flew to Sydney, because to drive it's 12 hours, but to fly it was about 3 hours. And we just had to get down to Sydney to be with our grandchildren, which we did. I'll cut out quite a bit, but we ended up with custody of the children, which was absolutely amazing, because we didn't want them to be with a father who was on drugs. And thankfully, the adjudicator could see beyond that, and so we got custody of the children. But there was something that happened to give me the confidence that I knew that we would get custody of the children, because 6 weeks after Danielle died, I remember I was having this dream, and there were all these questions in my mind, and because of the brutality of her murder, I was just absolutely, just in a state. And there were all these questions that I had. And I was having this dream, and in the dream I remember hearing laughing. And I shook my husband in the dream, and I said, listen, that sounds like Danielle. And with that I opened the door, and she was just standing there. And she had on like a short mini skirt made out of blue and greys and everything. And I remember thinking, wow, they wear mini skirts in heaven. And then she said, Mum, she said, don't worry about the way it happened. She said, there's no pain or suffering here. And for me, that was such assurance that she was okay, and her face was beaming. She had this huge smile on her face.
Wow.
And then she said, oh, Mum, she said, you should see my house, because she always wanted her own home. And it actually says in the Bible that God prepares a place for us, you know, in our taste and our desires, and she had her own home. And then I said, basically, Danielle, the father of the children's being a bit of a pain. We're, going through all of this and trying to go for custody. And she said, oh, Mum, she said, but he is the father. And she said, but I know that you'll take good care of them. And I knew, without a doubt, that we would get custody of the children, and we did.
So all that was in a dream?
It was all in a dream. And then the next minute I said, Danielle, I said, can you stay? And she said, no, Mum, I have to go back. And with that, she just disappeared. The amazing thing was, in the dream, I wasn't actually speaking verbally to her, but we were speaking to each other with thoughts.
Yeah, right.
And I've since read books about, you know, visitations to heaven, and that's how they actually communicate. So it was quite amazing. But then after she left, I just simply, I'd opened my eyes in the middle of that actually, and I was still having communication with her, you know, during that dream and that visitation. And I I was at peace, and I just laid down and went back to sleep.
Wow.
Yeah. And my pastor said the next morning, he was just so excited. He said, Roma, he said, that's just the goodness of God. He knew what you needed, and he allowed that visitation. And that helped me through, and every question that I needed answering was answered during that time. And that's just the goodness of God, because he knows what we need. And he's such a good God.
I imagine you would have had a million questions. Like, I guess the main question I think people would ask is, like, why God? Why did this happen? Like, who are you? Where are you? You know, I'm sure you had so many of those questions.
Yeah.
Do you remember having a lot of those questions, or why did you continue to follow God?
Yeah.
Even though something like that happened.
You know, I think when you really have an experience with a God who's real, it's different to just knowing about him. You know, it's head knowledge is different to really having a relationship. And I had developed a relationship with him, and I just knew he was there for me. Even though I had all the questions and why and all of that, and I couldn't understand it, but there was no way that I could run away from him. It didn't even enter my mind, Lee.
Yeah, okay.
You know, it was just something that I just knew he was still there for me. And I believe that Danielle shouldn't have been in that place, that she obviously was in a place that jeopardised her safety. And, you know, that was obviously the result of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like a beautiful response. You know, you go to him rather than run from him.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't make much sense. I know we do that, but
Yeah.
he is love. Like, he is our comforter.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so then we got custody of the children, and we brought them up, and basically the children's friends, that they were only not quite 2 and not quite 3 at the time. And we brought them up. They started school, and they were doing well. Lucinda had some terrible nightmares when she was about 7, and I had some counselling for her, which it was Christian counselling, and it was really hard to find someone who had dealt with trauma for children. It was quite difficult at the time, because it was back in the 90s. And by the time we had 6 visits with her, she didn't have any more nightmares. So that in itself was pretty amazing. Because the nightmares were someone was chasing her with a knife.
Oh, man.
So, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So it had impacted her.
wow.
But yeah, God really did heal her heart. And then, so we brought up our grandchildren, and like I said, you know, their friends thought that we were their parents, because we were fairly young. We got married young, and we were a similar age to a lot of other parents anyway. And when Lucinda was not quite 14 actually, and my husband, he loved to fly. And you can hear the planes going over now. He used to fly over here and wiggle his wings, you know, and wave to the kids in the cul-de-sac.
That's cool.
Yeah. Anyway, they decided to go for a fly, you know, a joy flight, just just a little fly over the Sunshine Coast, and we'd go down to the park after they got back home. And when they didn't get home at the allocated time, I just went for a really quick walk. And while I was out walking, I remember just talking to Jesus, and then all of a sudden this flash, checkered pattern, like the checkered pattern that you see in a police car, flashed before my eyes, and I just shook my head and just thought, that's ridiculous. But when I got home and I just started to walk up the driveway, something caught my attention to the left, and I looked and there was a police car on the driveway.
Oh.
And with that, the front door opened and there stood a policeman with my grandson, Jesse. He'd been here with him, waiting for me to come home, and I knew, without a doubt, something was wrong, and I just screamed out at him. I said, don't say anything. This has happened before. My girlfriend raced over from across the road and helped me inside. And when I got inside, my worst fears came to fruition, and he told me that the plane had gone down on the beach at King's Beach, and my husband and my granddaughter, Lucinda, that I was raising, were both killed on impact. And so again, my world just started to spiral. And I couldn't believe that here I was, you know, back in the same place, that shock, frustration, questions, anger.
Oh, man.
I didn't know which way to turn. My son and my daughter-in-law came and lived with Jessie and I for 2 months, because basically in a moment when that plane went down, our family was divided in half. In the morning, 4 lived in the house. In the afternoon, there were 2 of us. Now I was a single mum, and we had a business to run, and I had to go back into the business and run that with my son. It was just before the end of financial year, and it was just unbelievable what we had to deal with at that particular time. But we did. We worked through it, and we stayed with the business and we ran it, because Bernard had built up a really good business and a good relationship, and we wanted to honour him. And we did. We stayed, but we sold the business 5 years later. And after all of that, even though I had gone through all of that, I remember, and I went through all of the associated emotions that you go through with grief. You know, I was angry. I wanted to throw every plate in the house. I wanted to scream. I couldn't get away from it, because grief's it's just like a heavy weight that you can't escape from. And here I was again, 3rd time, and I didn't know how to escape it. And a friend told me, oh, have a drink when you get home from work. I wasn't a drinker at that point in time, and you know, that'll help you. Well, I had 1 and then I had 2, but after the second one and it wore off, it didn't help, and I was back in the same place. So nothing in this world that I looked at could alleviate the pain. But when I pressed into him, or I needed something, or I needed someone, whatever it was, he always provided exactly what I needed. Jesus, I'm talking about. And you know, I've got diaries full of the things that he did for me. You know, if I needed help with something, someone would ring up, or someone would come to the door with flowers, or you know, if I lost something, he would help me find it. Just little things, but the little things are big things when you're going through grief.
Yeah.
And I didn't punch the walls, holes in the walls. I bought a punching bag instead. But yeah, it was all consuming, and the difficulty was to help my grandson through it as well, because it was so all encompassing for myself. It you know, like, it was such a hard road. And then my son and his wife had to work through it as well, and my son had to come into the business. He was in the business, but he had to step into Bernard's shoes, and so he had a huge amount to deal with himself. So there were so many different areas that, that you can't even comprehend it when you're working through grief of what other people are experiencing. So I remember panic attacks that I had, and the first time that Jamie left the house, and I was there on my own, my security was in my home, and I just absolutely lost it. And so I couldn't be alone for quite some time. And that was just one of the effects. But I did discover that walking and exercise really, really help. They get the adrenaline and the cortisol running through your brain, and that was really helpful for me. And I still do it. I still do it to this day.
Yeah, good practical reasons.
Yeah.
And like hearing a story, it's hard to not be here crying. I know you've been journeying through this a long time. I can't really think of many more horrific things for someone to go through, like to lose a child. I imagine is probably the worst pain I could just about think of.
It is.
To lose your partner, your husband is, equally just horrific in another whole different set of ways, and loneliness and all these kind of things, and your grandson as well, wasn't it? Grandson?
I lost my granddaughter,
And I guess like similar question, like I'm curious, you say God's real and you turn to him, like what, saying his little things mattered. Can you remember, like I'm just curious about some of those things, and do you have other times where you really remember like something to do with his character, or what's he like in that situation for someone who is going through something similar, maybe doesn't know God? Like, what's he like? Why turn to him? Does he show up? I know you're saying the little things.
Yeah.
Was he absent? Would he respond? Yeah.
Like honestly, when you go through the initial stages of grief, you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to get through each day. And a lot of the time I didn't feel his presence. And that's just the reality of it. But the scripture does say that he never leaves us alone. He's always there. And he was, because I did see it in things that he did. And like one of the questions that I had after the plane accident was I needed to know that both Bernard and Lucinda had gone to heaven. I knew Lucinda had, because she just loved Jesus, and she was baptised, and my husband was raised Catholic. And sometimes we get this silly notion in our head that you have to become a Christian, you've got to do it a certain way. That is so wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's just heart relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
And he used to say to me, Rome, I pray. I don't pray the same as you, but I'm good. Anyway, after the plane accident, the doctor had given me a shot that night because I had gone into shock. And when I woke up the next morning, I needed to know immediately that they had gone to heaven. And as soon as I opened my eyes, my daughter-in-law came through my bedroom door and jumped into bed with me, and she told me what had happened through the night. And she said, my son, Jamie, just cried out to Jesus all night. He was just so distraught. Jesus, why'd this happen? And the next minute, in his mind, he heard this little voice that said, awesome, the 5 of us are here now. And he shook his head and he knew it wasn't him thinking, because he had to say, well, who's the 5? He was just thinking this. And the 5 were my mum, my husband's father, who died 3 years earlier, my husband, my daughter who had been murdered, and her daughter, my granddaughter, Lucinda. And I had that assurance. I didn't even have 1 second to entertain a thought that, what if they're not? because God knew that I had to know immediately, and that's what he did. He told me.
Wow.
And I just knew that they were all up there, and that is the inspiration for me. That gave me hope to continue my journey, knowing that one day I will be reunited with them in heaven.
Mm.
You know, and yeah, because if you don't have hope,
Mm.
you know, the scripture says hope deferred makes the heart sick, and I didn't have a chance for that to happen. You know, he just gave me that assurance that I will see them again.
Mm.
And so I work towards that, knowing that one day we're going to have a party.
Yeah, it's not the end.
Yeah.
Life's not only here.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's beautiful.
yeah,
And I think, you know, like for you, you probably understand in a way I could never comprehend what it's like as a parent to lose, you know, your child, and the Father sent his child to die for our sake.
yeah,
And you probably can relate to that and draw
Yes.
closer to the heart of God
yeah,
so much more through that experience. Not that that's, you know, why or anything, but
yeah,
why that'll happen. But,
yeah,
you know, like I guess all these things happen in our life, you know, and we can't explain and understand. And,
that's correct, yeah.
you know, I guess that's the curious things is why, for me, why do you draw to God? Why, you know, you've gone through these crazy things in life, and here you are still choosing him, following him, putting your hope in him,
Yeah,
seeing a further picture.
mm.
Yeah, and that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think in life, you know, you expect to lose a parent, and you semi-prepare for that because, you know, in their old age, you know that they're going to eventually pass away. But when you do lose a child, you don't. It's out of sync,
Mm.
and the enormity of losing a child is just all-consuming. You know, and because your child represent your future, you know, and your legacy. And yeah, I basically listened to, when I lost my daughter, and then I felt like I had an opportunity to make up lost ground that I hadn't done things with my daughter, and Bern and I just put our heart and soul into Lucinda and Jessie, and then they called us mum and dad, and essentially we were. So when I lost Lucinda, it was like losing a second child.
Mm.
But losing your husband too, you know, when we'd brought up two lots of children, it was just about our time to spend some time together and for him to retire. And even though it was earlier, he was only 53, but he'd always dreamt of retiring early.
Mm.
But we were sort of just at that point, and he was taken too. So yeah, there were many questions, but it was, I don't know, I just knew that my purpose was to tell people about God's goodness with what they went through, and that's what I've done since the accident, to try and just help others to work through whatever challenge, loss or grief they're going through, because I didn't want all of their deaths to account for nothing, Lee. You know, there had to be some good come out of all of the bad. And so I wanted to leave a legacy for our other grandchildren. I've got 3 other grandchildren to my son, you know, and tell them about the good things that, you know, each of them, the rest of the family did, and I put it in a book so that they would have it on in black and white, and they could see the goodness of God.
That's
you know.
good. Yeah, do you want to, I see you brought the book along here.
Yeah. I did.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about 3 years ago, and it took me about 14 months to write it because it was pretty horrific,
I can imagine.
because I had to relive it.
Yeah.
I was hospitalised twice, not realising that it was causing so much anxiety, but I was so determined. I was doggedly determined to finish it.
Good on you.
And amazing thing is I got an endorsement from Liam Neeson.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah, I connected with him on Instagram, and and he'd lost his wife 10 years earlier,
Yeah, right.
and in a skiing accident, and he'd put a post up, and it's 10 years since I lost my wife, and I just put on, I'm really sorry. I said, you know, my daughter was murdered, I lost my husband and my granddaughter in a plane accident. I said, you never forget them, never. And then he private messaged me.
Wow.
And then I said to him, oh, look, I've just written a book. Would you consider endorsing it? And he immediately said yes. And so I got his email address. I sent it over to his office. He read it. And he sent me back an amazing endorsement. It says, Roma Flood's writing is quite heart-touching and stunningly motivational. This book is undisputedly one of those books to read and meditate with during our darkest days. Liam Neeson, Golden Globe and Academy Award nominee. And I knew even after that that it had impacted him too, and it was well worth writing this book. My purpose has never been to sell books, you know, and quite frankly, it's no big deal to me that Liam Neeson endorsed it. It's a good talking point though.
Yeah, true.
But what's in the pages, and I know that, you know, God inspired me to write it for a purpose, because my purpose is to point to him and his goodness. And that's what I do in this book, you know, to help other people through whatever they're going through. And it doesn't have to be anything as major as what I've gone through. But no matter what it is, he cares. He cares about the little things. Like I said, you know, if I lost something, he'd help me find it. And when you have a relationship like that and you learn to talk with him and hear his voice, that's what he does. He just supplies everything that you need because he's so good.
That is cool. I love that you just want to encourage people with it, and a bit like doing these videos, you know, do the same thing, that others would just be encouraged. And if someone wants to buy your book or read it, where can they find it?
Well, it's on my website at the moment, which is romaflood.com, but I'm going to change that website shortly. I'm on Facebook, Roma Flood Author, and I've made an audio book as well, so it's on every audiobook site. It's also ebook, Amazon. There's so many different sites that you could just put in Despite the Odds by Roma Flood, and it comes up. My website has a trailer on it as well, which sort of gives a very, very brief overview of my life. So that's
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing this story. I'd love to just pray, if that's all right. I just feel like
thanks,
to
Lee.
be doing that. Thank you, Lord, that you're present here. Thank you for caring about us and the little things. And Lord, we just appreciate Roma's story and journey, and things she's, Lord, learned and grown about you from it. Thank you for being present in her life, Lord, and helping her, comforting her, Lord. It's just horrific what's happened. But you know everything that's happened in every detail, and we don't understand it all. But I just thank you that Roma was able to find comfort and rest in you. Thank you for being her friend and just bringing her peace. And I just appreciate this time she's been able to share. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Roma.
Pleasure, Lee. Thank you.